Hopefully you've seen them. I'm not going to pass them back yet because I have a couple of makeups I still have to give, so I don't want to give the answers to the students who haven't yet taken it. So that's why the delay on that. Today we're going to continue with recognition, only instead of doing objects, we're going to talk about recognition of faces. So when I look at this slide, I realize how out of date some of these are. Anybody recognize this person?
Very.
What's that?
Very up.
This one.
Isn't she a gymnast?
Yeah, that's good. Now, if I'd done this 4 years ago, you all would have remembered Michaela because of her famous smirk, which Obama is copying. Now, if you recall, she was in the Olympics and finished in, I forgot whether she finished second or third, but she didn't win the gold medal, and she was not happy about it. And so there's this famous picture of her on the dais with this facial expression while they were playing some other country's national anthem. Obama then decided he would copy it. Probably another 10 years, I show this slide in class and people wouldn't recognize him either, so it's a good thing I'm retiring. And man, will I be glad to get down to Florida. So just to remind you what we've been doing, we're going to talk about visual recognition. Last time we talked about recognizing contours and objects. Today we're going to talk about recognizing faces and scenes, and then on Thursday we will talk about recognizing events. So let's start with faces. This is a huge area of research, really big deal in computer vision. There are all kinds of practical applications why it would be good to be able to recognize faces. Unfortunately, most of the algorithms around don't work all that well. And by the way, people's perception of faces are not all that accurate either. We often make mistakes in recognizing people, but yet we can recognize people when their faces are grossly distorted. And I'll talk about that. We saw a little bit of that when we were talking about cubism and in the evolution of art. We'll talk a little bit more about that today. There's a style of art called caricatures. They use them in a lot of newspaper cartoons, that sort of thing, where they take somebody's feature, a very salient feature on someone, and they'll magnify it by many-fold so the head looks distorted, but people can actually recognize those distortions more easily than they can regular photographs of the same individual. So it turns out we get a ton of stuff from faces. It's not just recognition that we do from faces. We judge people's attractiveness. We judge their identity. You can judge a person's age from the face. Emotions is a big part of face perception. Gender, for the most part, you can tell males from females. We also use faces an enormous amount for communication. So how many of you have had a course in linguistics? If one person had a course in linguistics, oh, two. Did they talk about pragmatics in your course? All right, so linguistics is primarily about rules of grammar, rules of speaking, things like that. But there are a bunch of stuff that seem to be outside the language, but aren't really. For example, just your posture, cant your head to show sarcasm or things like that. So a lot of the communications that we do verbally is enhanced tremendously by by facial expressions. And so all this information is coming from a single face. It's really a big deal. Now let's talk about some of the problems of face recognition. or not just face recognition, but any of these things. These are difficult problems. The one we know about the most is identity recognition, and because of the many applications for this, right? I told you the example of my going through the airport and then taking a photograph, realizing it was me, and giving me my boarding pass, which surprised the hell out of me because I didn't think that was possible, but apparently it was on that flight. People have been studying this for a long time, and apparently they're starting to get a little bit of success. But the problem is you really don't want to have false alarms, right? So if you go through and you're going through the checkout and the machine goes off and said, we've got Osama bin Laden, and they whisk you off to a jail and strip search you and do all this stuff and you miss your flight, you would not be happy. So it's really important to avoid the false alarms when you're doing that. All right, so what makes face recognition difficulty? Well, the main thing is that pretty much all faces have the same basic structure. We got two eyes, we got a nose, and a mouth. So the things that make us different are pretty subtle. The other thing is there's lots of variability in faces that has nothing to do with the identity of a face. And they include things like head pose, right? Are you looking at me from a frontal direction, or are you looking at me in profile or 3/4? What are the illumination conditions? Am I illuminated from the left, illuminated from the right? Remember when you were all kids and you'd go out at night and put flashlights under your chin and you get those weird patterns of shading? Facial expressions. Your face isn't the same if you're smiling than if you're frowning. Facial accessories. Many of you wearing glasses. Earrings. I don't see any nose rings in here. But so we put accessories on our faces. And also there are the effects of age. And I'll talk more about that next time in event perception. In fact, I started off my life as a psychologist by studying the perception of head shape as a source of information to judge the ages of people. I'll talk more about that next time. And then we have cartoon faces and caricatures, which we'll consider as well. All right, so the idea is that different persons may have very similar appearance. Again, this is a dated slide. Anybody recognize these? You're probably a little old to have dealt with the Ashley twins, and the guys probably have no idea who they are. But so these are twin sisters that look very much alike. This is George Herbert Walker Bush and G.W. Look rather similar. Now, there's a database run here at OSU by Alish Martinez, and people use it for research all over the place. And one of the things that Alish does, which I think is really cool, is he gets individuals and creates photographs of them in a wide variety of conditions. So you get the same person with different facial expressions, with different pose, with different lighting, with different facial accoutrements. They can block part of the face. So these are all faces of the same individual. And again, pretty much you can recognize. The only one that you would not be able to recognize probably is this one here. So line drawings of faces tend not to work very well unless you're a caricaturist and you know how to tweak them in just the right way. Now here's an interesting, how many of you have seen this effect before? What do you see here?
A face that's upside down.
A face that's upside down. Does it look weird other than being upside down? Do you recognize who it is? Again, this is another dating the class here. That's a photograph of Margaret Thatcher. How many of you know who Margaret Thatcher is just a couple of hands going up. I'm really losing my cultural contact with the students at OSU. It's good I'm getting out of this business. I'm running out of examples. But other than that, it looks pretty normal. Let's turn it right side up. So why didn't you notice that?
I didn't see that the eyes and the mouth were upside down.
So even now it's hard to see. It looks right. So the idea here, and we'll talk about face blindness a little bit later, but one of the things about faces is we process the face as a whole, right? It's not like we pull out the individual parts. We see it as a whole, and it seems to be dependent on orientation. Objects don't behave that way. If you flip a part in an object, so with faces, you get a huge drop-off in performance if you have it right side up versus upside down. That's not the case with other objects, right? You take a photograph of a car and you show it right side up or upside down. Observers are equally good at recognizing them in either orientation, but faces are different in that regard. And upside down, you can't even notice these horrible distortions that make Margaret Thatcher look like this grotesque creature. Just for your interest, by the way, Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of England during the time when Reagan was president. They often referred to her over there as the Iron Maiden. She was a real tough woman. And I don't know how fondly remembered she is over there, but she was probably an effective prime minister. All right, here are some examples of caricatures. You recognize that guy? John McCain. How about, and obviously Obama. Does that, what John McCain looked like? All right, notice how they puff out his cheeks like that, and they give him these enormous teeth and the chin like so. Believe it or not, this actually enhances your ability to recognize people. The idea is that you take a characteristic feature that distinguishes a person from most other people, and then what the artist does is exaggerate those features. And that actually helps in recognizing the individual. Here's some more of these. Who's this guy? Vin Diesel. How about this one? Bruce Willis. So notice what's being exaggerated here. Nobody has an upper lip that big. Nobody has a neck like that and a head that small above it. But what they're taking is characteristics of these famous actors and enhancing them. Anybody recognize this one? What's that? Shakira. I almost named my dog Shakira. She already had a name when we adopted her, but whenever she sees another human, she wiggles her butt about 100 miles an hour. I thought Shakira would be a good name, but and I presume you all recognize him. And you see the exaggerated appearance with the giant mouth and the teeth. How about this one? I'm sorry? Angelina Jolie, Lara Croft. What's the exaggerated feature for her? Her enormous lips.
Oh, that's your
What did you say before?
forehead.
Yeah, that's normal.
Oh yeah, her forehead works too. She's all forehead and lips. She probably doesn't like this picture, but how about this guy? The hint is who I paired him with.
Oh, Brad Pitt? Yeah, he's
Who's that?
Leo.
And this? I bet Will Smith likes this. That's very Will Smith. So you get the idea. I mean, these are pretty gross distortions of the structure, but yet you're able to recognize them quite easily. Not really clear how we do that. And I would doubt seriously if the computer face recognition algorithms could do this at all. All right, let's switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about facial expressions of emotion, which has a pretty long history. It goes back to a guy named Duchenne in the 1800s, who was the first person to really study how facial structure changes with different expressions. Charles Darwin discussed this. He also studied it in the context of facial expressions of other animals. So those of you who have dogs, does your dog have different facial expressions to communicate with you? Monkeys have different facial expressions that they communicate with each other. So this is a fairly common thing in the animal kingdom. And then there's this guy here, Paul Ekman, famous psychologist, started in the 1930s, did some really interesting stuff on faces where he was the first to carefully do a mapping between the complex musculature of the face and how they're involved in the generation of different kinds of expressions. And so there's a whole system that Ekman worked out that people still use today to get at the underlying mechanisms of how we make these expressions. Now, keep in mind that young kids start making expressions almost the minute they're born, and they can copy expressions in other people. So this ability to signal our emotions with facial expressions and to recognize those emotions in other people is an innate thing that's built into our physiology, and it manifests itself at birth. Now here's what's generally recognized as the 7 basic expressions. So what can you tell me about this woman? Let's pick on you. How's she feeling?
Happy. I said happy.
Oh,
Yeah.
Pick on you then. How's she feeling?
Happy.
How's this one feeling?
Sad.
How about that?
Scared.
And that?
Like confused or angry or frustrated
Or pissed off?
yeah.
This one?
Surprised.
This one?
Also angry.
This would be generally called disgust. And this is a neutral face. All right. Now, all cultures of the world have these same expressions. They may mask them sometimes. I've noticed in classes when I have in certain countries of Asia, when women laugh, they'll put their hand up and cover their mouth. I've never seen an Asian guy do that, just the women. But I'm guessing it must be impolite to show laughter. I don't know, but now these are generally recognized as the basic expressions shared by all the cultures of the world. We start making those expressions almost as soon as we're born. There's a guy here at OSU, I've already talked about him a couple times, Alish Martinez, who came up with the interesting hypothesis that, according to him, we've got a much larger set of expressions than is accounted for in this basic set. And the way that he proposes that people do that is by mixing them in combinations. I'll give you some examples. So she looks happy. She looks surprised. She looks angry. All right, so let's mix these together in various ways. So we have happily surprised and angrily surprised. So this is what, when you propose to your girlfriend, this is the expression you hope to receive. This is the expression you receive when she catches you in bed with another woman. So she's both surprised and angry at the same time, and here she's both happy and surprised at the same time. Now these are obviously distinct facial expressions, but you can see the surprise here. That's the open mouth, but you can also see the anger. Notice the partial clothing of the eyes. So according to Elish, these are a much broader set of possible facial expressions. They're sort of listed down here at the bottom, but provide different ways of doing mixtures of this basic set to get a much more wider variety of expressions. And what's the benefit of having that? Right? Expressions have a reason. They're designed to communicate your feelings with other humans, right? So the more expressions you have, the more subtle abilities you have to communicate your feelings with others. And we do that. How many of you recognize this painting? Anybody seen this so where did you see this before?
Chicago.
Yeah, it's at the Chicago Institute of Art. I think I told you in an earlier lecture that one of the things I do when I'm in a museum is I just sit back and watch the people walk into a gallery and see what they're attracted to. And in the Chicago Institute of Art, there are two that people just gravitate to. This is one, and the other is the Sunday in the Park, the George Seurat painting. So you see big crowds on those and lesser ones on all the others. Tell me something about these people. What kind of facial expression is that guy? Is he expressing any emotion in here? Does he look like he's really happy? No? Does he look like he's sort of down? But it's a completely neutral expression. And his lips are not turned down. His lips are not turned up. Apparently, I've read about this people that these are paintings of two farmers that Grant Wood passed, I don't know, Indiana or someplace like that, and they absolutely despise this painting. Well, they're probably not alive now, but so the question is, what is it that makes this guy look sort of bummed out? How many of you have heard the expression, he has a hangdog look? Anybody hear that idiom? So oftentimes that's meant to express sadness. This guy has a particularly long face, and notice the size of his upper lip. So even though his mouth is not turned down at all, it's much farther down on his face than the mouths of any of you, right? Because he's got this big upper lip. And that's the thing that gives him that appearance. So Martinez, Alish, did a wonderful experiment where, so this is the original image of the guy, and this is an image where they distorted the image, and the only thing they did was shorten his upper lip. And they had people rate these things, and sure enough, subjects judged this one to appear sadder than that one. So the only thing that's changing is how big the upper lip is. Right? So it's not just the muscle movements that are communicating our emotions. It also can be the structure of the face. Right? So if you're born with a really long face and a really big upper lip, you're gonna be perceived as sort of down all the time. Now, the way that they tested that, they did it in a couple of ways. First of all, they did it with by modifying photographs of people. So here we have a guy where it pushed his eyes down and his mouth up, and you get this sort of expression. And people rate that as anger. And then if you just give them a little line drawing like this, they'll judge this as angry, this as sad, this as surprise, and this as disgust. Now you might ask, well, how do they study that? Well, the way they study it is using the following technique. So they show a picture. This is in a very rapid sequence. So you're seeing these things. You look at a cursor for 600 milliseconds. You see this picture for 600 milliseconds. There's a mask. Then a second picture appears. And you have to make a response, which is which one of these looks angrier, or which one of these looks sadder, or which one of these looks, depending on what emotion you're trying to study. And what they find is, and they can do this both with pictures and with line drawings like that, and what they find is that if they compare this to this and you ask about angry, they'll say this one looks angrier than that one. If you ask them about sadness, they'll say this one looks sadder than that one, etc. So people really can make use of this configuration information in order to judge emotions. Now, the thing I want you to keep in mind is that, right, in the ordinary information about emotions, like when I smile, right, I'm actually I'm distorting my face. I'm moving the edges of my lips up, the corners of my mouth up, or if I'm really sad, corners of my lips go down. So I'm doing an action to try and express my feeling at any particular moment. These kinds of configural things you have no control over, right? They're just there. It's part of the structure of your face. So if you have a face that's shaped like this, you're going to be seen as feeling sad much of the time, even if you're not. Now, just to give you a sense of how subtle some of the information about facial expressions are, keep in mind this is something that's been evolving for millennia, right? This is stuff we share with other animal species. And so you can see where biology, and it's really important to communicate emotions between animals of the same species. And one of the ways we do that is through blood flow, right? Our face is actually just crammed full of arteries and veins. And we need that because you have this dense musculature in there, right? So in order to be able to do all the stuff we can do with our face, you need a lot of muscles, and muscles need a lot of blood. So the question is, can we get information from the blood flow to make judgments about people's emotions? So here's another analysis from Martinez's group, where what they do is they take images of faces, and then they do a filtering of these things where they're just pulling out the red, which is indicative of the blood flow. Keep in mind that our skin is translucent. Light goes inside of it and comes back out. And so the light that enters into our face interacts with the blood and comes out. So what do you think blushing is?
Blood rushing to your face.
It's blood rushing to your face, and you can actually see that the redness when the light interacts with it and comes back. So the question is, what Alicia's trying to figure out is, does this have any effect on our perceptual judgments about facial expressions? And it turns out that it does. We can actually use this stuff. And so here is a bunch of the stimuli they used where they could have the blood flow be consistent with the facial expression or inconsistent with the facial expression. And when they're consistent, you're quicker to identify the facial expression than when they're not. Now, I told you before that many people believe that faces are special. And probably the first evidence for that was the idea that, unlike object recognition, faces, you're really impaired if you turn objects upside down. I'm sorry, if you turn faces upside down. You don't get that impairment if you do it with objects. And 60 Minutes did a piece on a set of individuals that have a what's called prosopagnosia. So it's commonly known as face blindness. So these individuals are unable to recognize faces, even their friends or their kids. I mean, it's a pretty debilitating disease. There's a famous book about, what's the title of it? Something like The Man Who Couldn't Tell His Wife from a Hat, or something like that. And so this is a 60 Minutes piece. There are two parts. I don't think I'll show you both of them. I'll show you a little bit of the second one and most of the first one on prosopagnosia.
Most of us take for granted that we can instantly recognize people we know by looking at their faces. It's so automatic. It almost sounds silly to even say it. Friends can put on a hat, cut their hair, and still we know them by their face. And we can do this for thousands upon thousands of faces without ever giving it a moment's thought. But imagine for a second what life would be like if you couldn't. If your wife or husband looked like a stranger, you couldn't tell your kids apart, couldn't recognize yourself in a mirror. As we first reported in March, that's what life is like for people who suffer from a mysterious condition called face blindness or prosopagnosia. It can make it nearly impossible to recognize or identify faces. If you've never heard of face blindness, you're not alone. Chances are your doctor hasn't either. It's been unknown to most of the medical world until very recently. Hearing about it can feel a little like entering the twilight zone. But for people who are face blind, the condition is very real.
The story will continue in a moment.
Next one, it gets more into the neurophysiology of it, but I will show the woman who never forgets a face.
No one knows what causes lifelong face blindness. It was discovered so recently, scientists are just beginning to unravel its secrets. And some of the clues are coming from
All right, I think we've had enough of that. It was interesting in my sensation perception course, was it last 2 years ago, I actually had a face blind kid. And it turned out he always sat in the front row, and just like you in the front row, I would always ask him questions, and inevitably, if I was asking to identify a face, he would be the first person. And even when I knew he had face blindness, I would still slip. And he ended up giving his term paper on that topic, and did a fabulous job. He was talking about events in his life and how it affects him. And but I think it just gives you a sense of how subtle face perception really is, and why it is that very smart engineers have been working on this for a very long period of time, and made surprisingly little headway for all the effort that's been put into it. But again, the demands for being able to do this are really huge, especially for security issues and that sort of thing. So I'm sure this is a line of research that will go on for a long time. Let me switch gears now, and instead of talking about our recognition of faces, I want to talk about our recognition of scenes. Now, do you all remember I showed you this slide earlier in the course when we were talking about attention, where if you takes a while to realize what's changing when the image flips back from one to another. So the fine details are easy to miss. But what you don't miss, and this is the important part here, is you notice instantly that this is a street scene. All right, so we're able to recognize scenes with less information than it takes to recognize the objects in those scenes. It's sort of a strange combination of results. Here's another example. Again, it takes a while for people to notice that this bar is moving up and down, but you notice instantly, and I could just show you this for a tiny fraction of a second, and you would tell me it's a couple having lunch on outdoors, right? So the scene you would identify immediately, even though the fine details, obvious changes you can miss. Here's another one. Again, the change here is this palm trees appearing or disappearing. This is making me think of Florida. 3 weeks. But again, it's easy to identify the scene. Now, we do this automatically. What do you see here?
2 deer.
2 deer in what?
Yeah, meadow or wooded area.
Meadow or wooden area. Again, you can show this for a tiny fraction of a second, and you're able to do that. Here we have a different context where now seeing the deer probably has a little bit more impact, no pun intended, than so here's an example of a study done by a guy named Dirk Bernard Walther, who was on our faculty for about 10 years and studied the neuroscience of scene perception. And these were some of the ones he studied. So you have a set of beat scenes, you have a set of highway scenes, you have a set of forest scenes, buildings, mountains, industrial scenes. Notice these are not mutually exclusive. And he was trying to discover what the brain areas are that are responsible for this. Now, I should point out the part of the 60 Minutes piece I didn't show you was on the neuroscience of this stuff. So it turns out that the part of the brain where in the infratemporal cortex, there's a region there called the fusiform gyrus. And if you have damage to that area, it can provoke face blindness. Now, there are 2 kinds of face blindness. There's those that are caused by injury, and then there's those that people are just born with. And one of the things in the film, again, that I didn't show you is the hypothesis, since we know the area that if damage causes face blindness, the fusiform gyrus. And so the researchers were thinking when they had these congenital face blind patients that they would have some reduced activity in that area of the brain, but they didn't. So whatever is causing the congenital face blindness is different from what's causing the injury-induced face blindness. It turns out that scene perception is in a very nearby area, as is object perception. So in that temporal cortex, there are some regions, if damaged, your face perception is intact, but you can't identify objects. There are other regions where your object recognition is intact, but you can't recognize faces. There are other regions where you can impair scene recognition. Right? So we've got these different kinds of recognition that seems to be happening in the temporal lobe. But as I said, nobody really knows how that's done. Is there any computer vision research on scene recognition? How well did they do?
I don't know what the latest benchmark is. I know there's 20 pages.
All right, so just to give you a sense of this, I'm going to give you a test and show you a bunch of pictures. So why don't you take a few minutes and study this slide. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put up another slide, and some of the pictures in the new slide overlap with this one. Can you tell me which ones they are? How about that? How about that? How about that? 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 Now, you guys are pretty good at this. This is the leftover ones. And think about it for a second. All the information that's in a picture. I don't think you'd do that well if I put up a set of, so what do we have here? For 16. If I gave you an array of 16 letters, you wouldn't get them all. But you're much better with pictures. We have amazing memory for pictures, at least the gist of pictures. I should be careful about that, because if I ask you to remember the details, you don't do nearly as well. So somehow, what we're able to do is process the gist. So the people who do scene recognition, how do they approach it?
Well, usually what they do is you transform the image space to synthetic space. You get convolution to a level.
So they're looking at just pure statistical features.
That's usually the general trend.
All right.
That's what I see.
Now, humans are clearly doing something different than that, because what we get is the gist. Now, I don't want to claim that we don't use statistics. Statistics of image features, we do. But the problem with doing that is that when you filter the images in the way that he says, you pretty much lose all the content. We keep the content. So however we're representing this, that gist is part of what we see. So famous woman who worked on this back in the 60s, her name is Molly Potter. She's still around. We can identify scenes in about 125 milliseconds. People can remember up to 2,500 and even 10,000 pictures at a rate of one image every 2 seconds. That's pretty amazing. But can we? So the question is, what is it we're getting from those images, and what are we not getting from those images? So here's an example of her rapid serial presentation. So in this case, you might have to press a button when you see a person as part of the scenes. And subjects are able to do this even though these images are flashing by at an incredibly fast rate. Let's consider this difference right here. So you agree they both look like, how many of you think these are the same picture? The gist is the same. All right, your job is to find the differences. Yeah?
The one on the left has more towers in the middle. So if you go up.
Here.
Towers right here exist.
And not over there. You see any others?
Narrow window. This one.
And that window's not on the left edge of the other one. I think there are about 5 of them up there. It takes a while to notice. But notice none of those details are necessary for the gist. Right, so this thing pops up and it's an old European castle. And all those details really don't matter. So the question is, how the hell are we able to do that? Now, last time I told you about Irv Biederman, who has a very popular in psychology model of object recognition. Irv's also done a lot of research on scene recognition. And what he proposes is part of what we do when we analyze the scene is that we're directly pulling out the relationships between different things within the scene. And he says there are 5 relationships in particular that if you violate those, you severely impair scene recognition. So a good example of that is support. If an object does not appear to be resting on a surface, right, you just see like a fire hydrant hovering in midair, that screws up your scene recognition. Interposition, so if I look at you and I can see through you for her, that screws up scene perception. Probability, object is unlikely to occur in a scene. So let's say you're looking at a kitchen scene and there's a fire hydrant in there. That impairs your ability to recognize the kitchen scene. Position, the object is likely to occur in that scene but is unlikely to occur at that particular position. So let's say, for example, that there's a stove in a kitchen scene but the stove is attached to the ceiling. That would screw you up. Size, the object appears too large or too small relative to other objects in the scene. So let's look at some examples of this. So here's one. It's a street scene. It's got a fire hydrant. Fire hydrant belongs in a street scene, but it's not in a place that you would expect a fire hydrant should be. And so if subjects are judging, is this a street scene, they'll be a little slower than they ordinarily, so they're a little bit slower if the fire hydrant is here than if the fire hydrant's down there. Here's the idea of interposition, where you have this transparent human being. That will screw you up as well. So you're a little bit slower to identify this scene than you would if this person were opaque. Notice the violation up here. You've got a couch floating up in the air there. Would slow you down recognizing the street scene. So Biederman's done a lot of research on this, and it works both ways. So you're faster at identifying objects if the objects are in a scene that's relevant to the object. So a fire hydrant's going to be recognized faster in a street scene than it will be in a kitchen scene. Similarly, if you're identifying scenes, a kitchen scene, you're going to be slower recognizing the kitchen scene if there's a fire hydrant in the kitchen than if all the stuff in the kitchen is likely to appear in kitchens. right? So when we're analyzing individual objects, the processing of the scene is being taken into account. And similarly, when you're processing scenes, the relevance of the individual objects in the scenes gets taken into account. Fine details we're not getting at all when we're looking at global properties like that. So I've just sort of sampled a little bit of this, especially the face recognition research. It's a huge area. Next time we're going to do a final type of recognition that is event perception, which is what I studied for most of the early parts of my career. I'll tell you some really old studies from back in the 70s, but apparently it's doing a comeback. And my friend Alish over in electrical engineering doesn't just study faces, but now they're also branching out into the study of events as well. But we'll talk more about that next time. So I'll see you on Thursday.